The park was unusually quiet that evening. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as Elena walked down the familiar path. Her routine jog had turned into a slow, cautious stroll. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. That's when she saw a small, black notebook lying on a weathered bench. It stood out, almost glowing under the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Who leaves a notebook just lying around? She muttered to herself, looking around. The park was empty, save for the distant cawing of crows. She hesitated before approaching the bench, her steps light as if afraid the ground might crumble beneath her. As she got closer, the notebook seemed alive. The pages fluttered slightly, though there was no wine. Her fingers trembled as she reached out. The moment she touched the cover, a voice echoed in her mind. It wasn't hers, yet it felt familiar. You're closer than you think. Are you ready to know the truth? Elena pulled her hand back, her breath catching in her throat. What the hell was that? But curiosity won over fear. She flipped open the notebook. The pages were blank except for a single phrase, written in shaky, uneven letters. Look inside yourself. Elena glanced around again. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet her heart raced like she was being watched. When she looked back at the notebook, the words were gone. The pages were completely blank. Her hands grew cold. She closed the notebook and turned to leave, but the park suddenly seemed wrong. The trees stretched unnaturally tall, their branches clawing at the sky. Shadows pulled around her feet, moving even as she stood still. A voice echoed again, low and chilling. This isn't just a park, this is you. And you know what's hiding here. Before she could process the words, a figure appeared, a little girl sitting on the ground, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Elena froze. The girl looked eerily familiar, her clothes were old-fashioned, her hair tied in messy pigtails. But it wasn't the appearance that unnerved Elena. It was the way the girl looked at her with empty, hollow eyes. You left me here, the girl said softly. Her voice was small, yet it seemed to fill the entire park. What are you talking about? Elena whispered, her throat dry. You forgot. But forgetting doesn't erase things. Elena barely remembered how she got home that night. The notebook was still in her hands, and she placed it on her desk as if it might disappear if she looked away. She stared at it for what felt like hours, unsure whether to open it again. Finally, she flipped it open, and this time, it wasn't blank. The pages were filled with memories, her memories. The time she got lost in a department store as a child, crying as strangers passed her by. The night she buried her face in her pillow after losing her favorite stuffed toy. The day her best friend moved away, and she told herself it didn't matter, even though it did. And then, at the very end, a fresh entry appeared. Today, you saw me in the park. The past doesn't forget, and it won't let you go until you face it. If you don't, it will consume you. Elena slammed the notebook shut, her chest tightening. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The next day, she returned to the park, clutching the notebook tightly. She had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The park looked different now. The trees were lifeless, their leaves blackened and curling. The grass was dry and brittle, crunching under her feet. And there, on the same bench, sat the little girl. But this time, she wasn't holding a rabbit. She was holding the notebook. You came back, the girl said, her voice devoid of emotion. Who are you? Elena demanded, though her voice cracked. I'm you, the girl said simply. I'm the parts of you that you've ignored, the pieces you've buried. But they never go away, and now, it's time to remember. The girl held out the notebook. Take it. Finish the story. That's the only way you'll be free. Elena hesitated, her heart pounding. But she knew she had no choice. She reached out and took the notebook. The moment her fingers touched it, the world around her exploded into light. She was no longer in the park. Instead, she was surrounded by fragments of her life, happy moments, painful ones, things she thought she had forgotten. And in the center of it all was the truth she had been avoiding. Elena realized she had spent her life running from her fears, her failures, even her own emotions. She had buried them deep, pretending they didn't exist. But they had always been there, waiting for her to acknowledge them. As the visions faded, she found herself back in the park. The little girl was gone, and the notebook was empty once more. But for the first time in years, Elena felt lighter. She had faced her past, and while it still lingered, It no longer controlled her. She walked home that evening with a new sense of purpose. The notebook had taught her something she would never forget. You are your past, but only you decide your future. And with that, Elena began to rewrite her story, this time on her own terms. The notebook's warning Elena thought the nightmare was over. She thought the weight had lifted and that she was free to move on. But the notebook had other plans. The following morning, as sunlight streamed through her window, she noticed the notebook wasn't where she had left it. She had placed it on her desk the night before, yet now it lay open on her bed, its blank pages stark against the rumpled sheets. A fresh sentence had appeared. This is only the beginning. Her heart sank. She slammed the notebook shut and threw it into her closet. Days passed. Elena avoided the notebook, going through her routine as if everything were normal. Yet, something wasn't right. Shadows in her apartment seemed to linger longer than they should. Objects weren't where she remembered placing them. One night, as she brushed her teeth, she caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But when she turned, there was someone standing in the hallway, a man in a dark coat. His face was obscured by shadows, but his presence was suffocating. Who are you? Elena whispered, gripping the sink for support. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed toward her bedroom. She felt an icy chill run through her. What do you want? But the man dissolved into smoke, leaving behind the faint smell of ash. Terrified, Elena hesitated before stepping into her room. The notebook was now on her bed again, its pages open and waiting. This time, the words weren't cryptic. They were direct. You must keep writing. She didn't understand. Writing what? She asked aloud, though no one was there to answer. Her hands trembled as she picked up a pen and placed it to the page. Instantly, the pen began to move, her hand guided by unseen force. She wrote about her dreams, her fears, her regrets, all the things she had never dared to speak aloud. The words poured out of her like a dam had broken. But as she wrote, the room grew colder, darker. A new line appeared at the bottom of the page, written in a handwriting that wasn't hers. If you stop, they'll come. Elena woke the next morning to find strange symbols scrawled across the walls of her bedroom. They weren't written in ink but carved into the plaster, deep and jagged. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Have you finished the story yet? She stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The day blurred by in a haze of paranoia. Every noise felt louder, every shadow darker. That evening, she sat at her desk, staring at the notebook. If writing was the only way to end this, she had to continue. But as she wrote, the vision started. The little girl from the park appeared again, this time standing outside her window. Her hollow eyes were filled with anger. You think you can just write it away? The girl hissed. Elena screamed, dropping the pen. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous before she vanished into the darkness. Elena was desperate. She knew she couldn't continue living like this. The notebook wasn't just a diary, it was a trap. A tether to something far darker than she could comprehend. That night, she sat by candlelight, staring at the notebook. What do you want from me? She whispered. The pages flipped on their own, stopping at a single word scrawled in blood red ink. Obey. Elena realized the notebook was feeding off her emotions, her fear, her pain, her memories. But what if she gave it something else? She began to write again, but this time, she wrote about hope, about forgiveness, about love. She filled the pages with stories of resilience, of light overcoming darkness. The room trembled, the shadows in the corners writhed and hissed. The fire didn't burn her, though it felt warm, comforting. As the notebook turned to ash, the room grew still. Elena collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what had just happened, but for the first time in weeks, she felt free. The park was back to normal when she visited it the next day. The bench was empty, the shadows ordinary. But Elena knew she would never be the same. The notebook had forced her to face her past, her pain, and her fears. And while it had nearly consumed her, it had also taught her something important. We are the authors of our own stories. Even when darkness surrounds us, we can choose to write the light. As she walked away from the park, Elena couldn't help but feel that someone or something was watching her. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She had written her story, and it was hers alone. Elena hoped the nightmare was over. She had burned the notebook, faced her fears, and reclaimed her life. But the shadows of her experience seemed to follow her everywhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't truly finished. One evening, as Elena was preparing for bed, she heard a faint sound, a whisper, almost inaudible, drifting through her apartment. "You think it's over." Her blood ran cold. She turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. Her bedroom, bathed in the soft glow of her bedside lamp, felt suddenly foreign. The shadows on the walls seemed to ripple like water. "No," she said aloud, her voice trembling. "I ended this." But the whisper came again, this time louder. "Stories don't end, Elena," they echo. The next morning, Elena found something impossible waiting on her desk. The notebook, intact, whole, as if it had never burned. She hesitated before approaching it, her breath shallow. When she finally dared to pick it up, the first page was blank except for a single sentence. "You thought you could change the ending." Her hands shook. She flipped through the pages, and to her horror, they were filled with her handwriting entries she didn't remember writing. Each page detailed events from her life that hadn't happened yet. One entry stopped her cold. November 23rd, 8:15 p.m. The stranger knocks. She glanced at the clock. It was 8:10 p.m. Elena's heart raced as the minutes ticked by. She stared at her apartment door, dreading the sound she knew was coming. At exactly 8:15 p.m., there was a knock. Her instinct screamed at her not to open it, but something stronger, a strange, irresistible pull drew her forward. Her hand trembled as she turned the doorknob. On the other side stood a man she had never seen before. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "You're Elena," he said, his voice calm but unsettling. She nodded, unable to speak. "I'm here for the story," he said. Stepping inside without an invitation, the man sat down at her table, placing a leather-bound book in front of him. It looked ancient, its cover cracked and worn. "This isn't just about you," he said, tapping the book. "The notebook is part of something much bigger, and you've only scratched the surface." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Every story has a purpose, Elena. Every word written in that notebook changes the fabric of reality. But the question is, who's writing yours?" Her stomach twisted. "I thought I was." The man smirked. "You're a character, Elena, just like the rest of us. But someone or something is holding the pen." The man opened his leather-bound book, revealing pages filled with unfamiliar symbols and diagrams. "The notebook chose you for a reason. It feeds on unresolved stories, on lives that are stuck. But if you don't take control, it will consume you." Elena's pulse quickened. "How do I stop it?" He slid the book across the table. "You have two choices. Keep writing and let the notebook dictate your life. Or break the cycle by finding the original story, the one that started it all." "What happens if I break the cycle?" The man's expression darkened. "You might free yourself. Or you might destroy everything." Elena didn't hesitate. She knew she couldn't live under the notebook's control. With the man's help, she began researching the notebook's origins. They uncovered a trail leading to a small, forgotten town called Black Hollow, where the first known mention of the notebook had appeared in the 1800s. The town was shrouded in mystery. Its inhabitants had vanished overnight, leaving behind only cryptic writings and a single phrase carved into the town's church. The story ends where it began. Elena and the man arrived in Black Hollow under a sky choked with storm clouds. The town was eerie, its buildings crumbling and overgrown with vines. The air was heavy, as if the place itself was alive and watching them. The church stood at the center, its spire piercing the sky like a dagger. As they entered, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as though she had been there before. On the altar lay another notebook, identical to hers. When she touched it, the world seemed to shift around her. She was no longer in the church, but in a vast, empty void. A voice echoed in the darkness. "You come far, Elena." But the story was never yours to end. A figure emerged, a shadowy, faceless being cloaked in smoke. "I wrote the first story," it said, "and every story since. The notebook is my creation, a way to weave lives into tales worth telling." "Why me?" Elena demanded. "Because your life was stagnant," the figure replied. "I gave you conflict, fear, purpose. Without me, you'd still be drifting, but now, you want freedom. Are you willing to pay the price?" Elena stood firm. I won't let you control me anymore. The figure laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Then write your own ending, Elena. But remember, every choice creates ripples. The notebook appeared in her hands, its pages blank and waiting. For the first time, she felt truly in control. She began to write, her words defying the figure's power. With each sentence, the void around her cracked, light pouring through the fractures. I choose my story, she whispered as the world collapsed around her.